Australia is sometimes described as the lucky country, a place where everyone gets a fair go. That's our binding myth, you could say. Is it really true, though, that class here is not a barrier? Social, economic and cultural inequalities have always existed in Australia and are, in fact, rising. Many Australians live in entrenched poverty, but it's precarious and insecure labour in particular that's growing. And yet, class, you could say, is often missing from or obscured in our public and political debates. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues and with a federal election fast approaching, it's as vital a time as ever, surely, to delve into the realities of class in Australia. To tell us more, I'm joined by Steve Threadgold, who's co-edited a new book called Class in Australia. Steve's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Newcastle and does a lot of work with young people in class. Steve, welcome.
Hi, Geraldine. Thanks for having me on.
What exactly do you see the situation to be in this country today? Why are we so poor at talking about it? That's one of your central points.
Yeah, it is. It's class kind of haunts all our relations, I think, both economically, but even in the media and our pop culture. It's present, but it's kind of haunts things, and we don't really like to talk about it very much for some reason. When you do hear, say, our political leaders talk about class, they tend to, what I would say, reverse it in a way. So if we make an argument for, taxing billionaires or having some kind of shared wealth, that's like all of a sudden there's some kind of class war against the rich or something. But that's really the only time you hear it. And the other way that inequality is talked about mostly is it's individualised. So if someone, doesn't do well at school, loses their job, or is in poverty, it's often they're blamed as an individual. They're lazy, they don't work hard enough, or they made the wrong choices. But what we find is a class, that those kind of things, like those kind of inequalities, are much more systematic than that.
Well, I mean, that's the old divide, isn't it, between the people who tended to come from, basically a Marxist background, I don't mean that literally, would look at things in the broad and say that, you mustn't effectively blame individuals, versus a more, I suppose, a libertarian view, which is so much does rest on the individual set of choices. So that is a very old divide, isn't it?
That's right. And the notion of hard work in particular today is really celebrated. And of course, if, some people maybe work harder than others and make the right choices and all that kind of stuff matters, but people start in different places. So, you can work as hard as you want, but if you go to a school that's, a bit dodgy, doesn't have a lot of funding, it's really packed classes, no air conditioning, it's a bit of a different experience than, going to a school with, rowing and massive football fields and air conditioning and that kind of stuff. So these things are embedded throughout our social systems. Using that example, a child can work as hard as they want, but more generally, it means that if you've got a bit of a head start by being in those kind of more privileged places, more likely to achieve. So this is where I think the language of class is really important to be brought back into public kind of consciousness, I suppose, because otherwise it seems to me that inequalities don't get the proper explanation that they need and are mostly then kind of left to the kind of blame to the individual.
Before we go any further, I must ask you then about, because even the language you're using, I suppose, positions you in a way, and you say part of the problem with discussing class is that usually it reverts down to the political attitudes of the writers about class. And so, you are clearly don't like what you're seeing. We should have that on the table, shouldn't we?
Yeah, well, journalistically, for instance, I'd really like to see journalists, when they're talking about various social problems, invoking class privilege more. The problem being, I suppose, and I've written about this in my own work, is that our media class tends to be quite middle class, right? So they tend not to have the experiences themselves and the emotional relations to some of the problems we're talking about. So then it's easier for them, I suppose, to leave that kind of thing out. So but definitely, I think, starting to think a little bit more about these wide social problems that we have, rising inequalities, huge precarity in the labour market, particularly. And what's interesting about that too is precarity is rising up the class system into the middle classes. And so if we can think about these things on a more systematic basis like that, I think the public will be better informed about what's going on.
It's very much a book of sociology. There's quite a lot of sociology jargon in this. It's not a sort of a simple little, storytelling, but you do cite some very interesting things that are worthwhile thinking about. For instance, the TV program Struggle Street, which on SBS, you say, showed a lot about class and its confusions. I think one of your writers talks about this. How do you see, or how do you explain, in your words, what it tended to show?
Well, yeah, Penny Rossiter from the University of Western Sydney wrote that chapter, and it's a really interesting chapter. And what she talks about in this is the way that something like poverty is framed on our television shows is really important. And so in that chapter, for instance, she talks even about some of the different techniques of the way that cameras linger on things and the way that the various kind of things that represent people, like garbage or their house or something, is kind of stands in and invokes emotion in the watcher that may not really be a reality of the situation of that person.
It also sort of tends to say, I think, sorry to interrupt you, but it tends to say, thank God I'm not there.
Yeah, definitely. When we're consuming that really as a form of entertainment as much as a documentary, people watch those things in different ways. So there's definitely a case of that as well. But what I think the point is, and I've kind of written about this myself in the past as well, is that, again, a lot of the voiceover, a lot of the contextual parts of those shows tend to elide the more structural things that are going on and focus on the kind of messiness and struggles of the day-to-day life. Now, it's really important that stuff gets represented. But again, when it's kind of seems to be all about Johnny made the wrong choice in high school or whatever, and then this is where he's at, that to me kind of then becomes a problematic representation.
There's quite a bit about how the middle class draws away from maybe their own origins in the working class and so on, and then thinks, again, the relief for being away from it, and then the standing back and looking, and then the distance between, say, people in the middle class and people perceived to be in the working class. And someone like Jackie Lambie cuts right through that and speaks so much from the heart about what she has gone through and makes it very vivid, which is a very interesting role she plays.
Absolutely. And she is a person that seems to speak often about the views of the disadvantaged, and she's experienced that herself. Others, people on the left criticise her for many kind of other kinds of views. But again, the class relation here in terms of the way that Jackie's represented in the media, the piss taken out of her a lot, in terms of the way she speaks. She doesn't speak like a private school person. Sean McAuliffe has taken, has whole characters based around that kind of stuff. So the class relation and the class analysis of someone like Jackie is quite complex, because she's a very rare instance of someone from a relatively disadvantaged background with a voice in the Australian public sphere. But beyond when she gets to speak for herself, much of the writing and talking and representations of her tend to be parodies.
Well, look, that's so interesting. I was thinking about the work you've done yourself, as you explain, researching the terms bogan and hipster as opposite ends of the spectrum, and what these terms tell us about class. Now, why are they so problematic for you?
Yeah, well, they're very interesting ways, because I think they're kind of Clayton's class categories, if you know what I mean. Remember the kind of Clayton's drink, the drink you have when you're not having a drink because it didn't have alcohol in it? They kind of ways that do allow us, and ways that class are represented and spoken about in the public sphere without really talking about class. And the chapter by Deb Waugh and Keith Jacobs and Henry Paternoster in our book do this, and also I've written about it in another book. Bogan has tended to stand in for, kind of vulgar working class tastes. Hipster is kind of ironic middle class consumer cultures. And throughout the kind of 2000s, there's been so much written about those two figures in the media. And they tend to, again, stand in for those things. But what's interesting about those things is that the hipster has often been written about as a quite ironic, almost playful figure, and the bogan tends to elicit much more kind of denigration. And I think the reason for that, again, is if you do a class analysis of who's writing, is, again, our media classes tend to be quite well-educated, probably have tastes that overlap a lot with the hipster. And so the problem of the hipster tends to be seen a little bit more ironically. A lot of the writing about the hipster was kind of playful and joking, whereas the bogan is generally invoked to kind of say that person's vulgar, that VB drinking person, who drives the Commodore, are doing things wrong. They don't have any taste. They live in these big houses and have big TVs and do all the wrong things as opposed to my kind of middle class lifestyle. But yeah, and what's other interesting as well is the hipster's kind of this global figure, like it's used around the world, particularly in the West, where different countries have different versions of the bogan. There's the chav in the UK and the redneck or whatever in the US. They tend to have more specific versions. But yeah, what does happen with these figures is they change over time, but they become representational of cultural aspects of class, particularly around taste. And then by using those figures, you don't need to say, working class people are this. You can kind of invoke the bogan, and it kind of stands in for that kind of thing, I suppose.
Look, yeah. Can I just? I thought you might make more, and you have a bit, and very interestingly, but about education. That it complicates a lot of these neat assumptions. I mean, people like David Runciman, and I'm always going on about this with his, Talking Politics podcast. He just thinks it is the great divide, and it determines so much educationally, economically, in terms of assessment. And you say that there's a lot of sort of perceived moral virtue wrapped up in the middle classing of people, often associated with education, and then they really do, without even necessarily recognising it, can start to consider themselves very differently. Now, do you think that is a process very much underway in Australia?
Definitely, yeah. Now, we have some really good analysis of class in education in Australia, and education is a kind of field of study where class has been really, I think, well used to elicit what's going on. So certainly in very simple things like the private-public divide and the levels of funding that go on there, but very more broadly from a sociological perspective, education systems are seen to tend to reflect the needs of the more wealthy and the more privileged, and then schools and teachers reflect those values. So people from disadvantaged backgrounds almost have to come into those systems and learn to be someone else. And so education systems are at the very heart of the way that class is socialised in Australia. It allows people to think people in relatively privileged schools will feel more comfortable in those areas. They're quite exclusionary. They set up networks into business and politics and other powerful institutions. If you're not in those networks, you're largely excluded from them, in terms of who you know and having access to them. But also, if you're not part of that socialisation process, you'll feel uncomfortable in those circles anyway, and you're likely to kind of opt out or exclude yourself. So there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy going on there as well. So the cultural and symbolic aspects of class are really interesting to think about that in education systems as much as the economic.
Look, maybe we should sort of gradually draw to a close, because you could talk forever about this, couldn't you, to politics, because undoubtedly it'll play a role, whether it's named as that in the election. And as you say, from John Howard's Battlers to Scott Morrison's Quiet Australians, politicians keep using their own class definitions, and this Quiet Australians is such an interesting one. Why do they keep doing this? Is it a winning formula?
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert on whether those terms kind of make people electable, but they certainly seem to speak to the kind of hopes and fears of many Australians. I mean, I think there was Howard's Battlers, but he also used to use the term Middle Australia quite a lot, and that was actually a term coined by a sociologist. So, yeah, they kind of these. It's almost like the drawing of a figure of the kind of what's the normal thing in Australia that deserves to be looked after by politicians, and it's like the nuclear family, the suburban hardworking family kind of stuff is kind of what is normally emphasised there, and unfortunately, it always tends to be the white version of that. So these things, I think, are interesting to think like that. But why do you say that?
Why do you say that, though? Because what do you mean that the white version of it is emphasised?
Well, our politicians are constantly dog whistling towards, white Australians, Anglo-Australians. That tends to be what they represent. But I think what's interesting about the Quiet Australian thing, and when it comes to the class analysis, is that I think the pandemic has brought out aspects of this that What's happening recently, for instance, with the changes in the rules about people being allowed to go back to work much more quicker? Why are truck drivers and things like that being encouraged to go back to work after 5 days instead of 7 days? The quiet Australian there, the hardworking truckie that's delivering our food and our online shopping, apparently their health isn't as important, right? They can go back in 5 days, not 7, right? Because why is that? Because the whole system's breaking down without the hard work of those people. So they're the kind of quiet Australians that those labels, I think, have been dedicated to before. But like what's happening in this pandemic, we're actually seeing the real importance of that hidden labour in the system that's largely ignored, mostly, I think, by our leaders. You can see here what's happening there, and this is a very much a class relation, is that our politicians are just seeing these people as human capital. They're just seeing workers here. They're not really seeing, actual humans here that are sick that might need a bit of time off work. We need to get them back to work. Why? Because I need to get my online shopping in. So I think, again, that the pandemic is bringing out some of these class inequalities in ways that it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, how people feel treated in those kind of terms at the next election.
Yes, there's all sorts of things that are going to be tested in this whenever it happens.
Yeah, that's true.
Look, Steve, thank you very much indeed for, winding a way through it, and our listeners will have their own thoughts, no doubt, but I appreciate your time.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having us on. I really appreciate it.
Stephen Threadgold from the University of Newcastle with it. It's quite an academic book. The co-editor of Class in Australia, Rogers, come through and said, "No, I use hipster and bogan equally derogatively." In fact, some of your remarks are very amusing. So thank you. Keep them coming.